Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive.
Hello. Yes, today we're looking at the second commandment. Exodus 20, verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an idol.
Exactly. And we're digging into this using some really interesting source material excerpts from a YouTube transcript that takes a biblical humanities angle.
Right. It offers a perspective that might be a bit different from what many people usually hear.
So our mission, really, is to get beyond maybe the most common understanding. We want to unpack what this source suggests is a deeper meaning.
Especially focusing on that little phrase, for yourself, the source argues it's key.
Yeah, and how this command, understood this way, could speak volumes about, systemic issues, things that have happened throughout history, and maybe even affect us today.
Okay, so where do we start? The usual interpretation, the one most people know,
is basically, don't make physical statues or images of God or, other gods. Don't worship them.
Pretty straightforward. And we should acknowledge that's the common view, maybe what you'd hear in many traditional settings.
But right away, the source we're looking at flags that phrase. For yourself. It really zeroes in on that.
Yes, suggesting that's where the deeper meaning lies.
Yeah.
It implies the issue isn't only the object itself, the statue or whatever.
It's more about the why, the motivation.
Exactly. The motivation and who ultimately benefits. It's not just what you're making, but why you're making it. And crucially, are you making it for yourself?
Okay. And if we look back, historically speaking, taking the command just as no images has actually caused a lot of trouble, right?
Oh, absolutely. You had major conflicts like the whole iconoclasm debate periods where religious symbols were systematically destroyed.
Yeah.
Big controversies.
And the source we're using views those events as, well, kind of missing the point.
Yeah, like a fundamental misunderstanding of what the commandment was truly getting at. It wasn't primarily about smashing objects.
Because the Bible itself describes God in ways that make a physical representation impossible, doesn't it?
It does. God as spirit without form, self-existent, transcendent beyond our world, but also immanent, present within it, personal.
So someone, or rather a being, who just cannot be captured or contained in a material thing, like a statue.
Right. And that description reinforces the source's idea.
Hmm.
If God can't be represented accurately, then making an image must be serving some other purpose.
Pushing us back to that for yourself idea.
Exactly. It suggests that the command is less about the physical image and more about truly understanding God, our relationship with God, and avoiding twisting that relationship for our own ends.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. The source connects this for yourself idea to something much larger historically.
Mm-hmm. It points to the context of ancient societies and their massive religious building projects.
Like the pyramids in Egypt, you mean? Or those huge temples in Mesopotamia, ziggurats and things.
Precisely. The source emphasizes these weren't just local shrines. They were enormous, state-sponsored, often imperial undertakings.
Right, requiring unbelievable amounts of resources, money, materials, labor.
And that's the critical question the source raises. Where did all that stuff come from? The wealth, the manpower.
Let me guess. Not bake sales.
Not exactly. The source is pretty blunt. It argues it mostly came from conquest, war plunder, captured goods.
I mean, the labor.
The blood and sweat, as the source puts it, of enslaved people, often war captives. Brutal exploitation.
Wow, okay. And the connection back to the commandment.
Here's the core insight from the source. These empires, these powerful states, they often use the name of their god or the divine to justify it all.
How so?
By framing it as, a blessing from the gods or building for the glory of God. They used religious language to legitimize a system built on violence and exploitation.
Okay, I see where this is going. So putting it together, the source argues that making an idol for yourself on this grand scale, it fundamentally means using God's name, using religious authority.
To construct and maintain systems of exploitation that actually benefit your own power, your own wealth, your own empire.
That's a really powerful interpretation. It reframes the commandment entirely.
It does. It makes it a radical rejection of that whole system of imperial religion, a system that co-opted the divine for human power and oppression.
And that feels very different from how we sometimes talk about idolatry today, doesn't it?
It really does.
Uh-huh.
Often, the modern focus is very individual, very internal.
Like, my idols are things I desire too much. Maybe money, success, relationships, possessions. Things I put before God in my own heart.
And the source acknowledges there's some validity to that personal dimension, of course. Individual desires can absolutely become idols.
Huh.
But the source argues that focusing only on that internal, personal struggle kind of misses the main target of this specific commandment as it was originally given.
How so?
It suggests that reducing it purely to personal desire risks downplaying the huge structural, systemic problem the commandment was initially addressing. It can inadvertently separate our faith from bigger questions about social justice, power dynamics, and how societies are organized.
Right, so it connects faith much more directly to societal structures. Okay, that makes sense for, say, ancient Egypt or Babylon, but what about Israel itself? The source tackles this, right, like Solomon's temple.
Yes, that's the really challenging application the source brings up. Solomon's temple was central, hugely important in Israelite religion, a massive project.
So how does this critical lens apply there? Where did those resources come from?
Well, the source dives into the biblical accounts. It points out that David, Solomon's father, spent a lifetime at war and accumulated, quote, unimaginable amounts of gold, silver, bronze, iron
From
conquest. The source highlights details about thoroughly plundering surrounding nations.
That sounds pretty similar to the empires we were just talking about.
It does raise questions.
Yeah.
The source even mentions stripping metal from the farming tools of their own people, the Israelites, and still having to sell off land to finance the temple construction.
Oof, it's dark.
It leads the source to pose that uncomfortable question. Was this immense project, with all its grandeur, truly being built for God, understanding God as this transcendent, formless being?
Oh.
Or was it also, perhaps significantly, a display of national power, royal wealth, basically a monument for David and Solomon themselves, built in that critical sense for yourself?
And thinking about it that way might shed light on why later prophets, like Jeremiah, were so critical of the temple cult at times.
Exactly. Or why Jesus himself, challenged the activities happening in the temple courts.
The source suggests the temple's eventual destruction reinforces this idea.
Yes, that God ultimately can't be manipulated or contained by human structures, especially if those structures become entangled with exploitation or self-aggrandizement rather than reflecting God's true nature.
And this pattern, this dynamic, the source sees it echoing later in history too.
It does. It draws parallels to things like the construction of some of the massive medieval cathedrals in Europe. St. Peter's Basilica is mentioned.
Incredible buildings, obviously, works of art, but the funding.
That's the question. The source points out that those projects were also often funded through methods that put enormous strain on ordinary people.
Like the sale of indulgences. That was a big one, wasn't it?
Yes, or heavy taxes that, quote, squeezed the population, causing real suffering, especially for peasants or serfs.
So again, the source urges us to look past the impressive facade, the aesthetic beauty, and ask that same question through this biblical lens.
How was it resourced? Who benefited? Was it genuinely for God, or was it partly constructed for yourself, for the power and prestige of the institution on the backs of the vulnerable?
Which brings us inevitably to the present day. The source raises a similar question carefully about the contemporary church.
It notes phenomenon you sometimes see, maybe a kind of competitive drive in some quarters to build bigger and bigger church buildings, more elaborate facilities.
Holding dedication ceremonies that might echo the scale and spectacle of, say, Solomon's temple dedication.
Right. And the source isn't condemning buildings outright, but it encourages reflection. Could that ancient pattern focusing heavily on physical grandeur, on external show,
potentially diverting focus or resources from other core aspects of faith, could that be repeating, even subtly?
Is the emphasis on the structure itself, rather than what the structure is meant to facilitate?
Because the source argues the real essence of the church, drawing maybe on the model of the synagogue, isn't necessarily about the size of the building or the extravagance of the worship service.
But more about being a community centered on learning, teaching, and living out God's word.
So if we pull all these threads together, the source's big argument is that the second commandment is this incredibly deep, persistent warning.
Yeah, ringing down through history, not just against literal statues, but against any system, any culture, any practice that uses God's name.
Or religious language or divine authority.
To actually enable exploitation, to build up human power for yourself, often at the expense of other people.
That really broadens the scope. And it leaves you, the listener, with a pretty significant question, doesn't it?
It does. Are there ways, maybe subtle or hidden ways, that these kinds of idolatrous system structures built for yourself under the banner of faith might still be operating today within religious communities or institutions?
Things built perhaps on dynamics of power or exclusion or even financial exploitation rather than genuinely reflecting God's character.
It really pushes us to think beyond just individual piety and consider the structural dimensions of what idolatry might mean.
So, okay, where does this leave you listening to this? If understanding God authentically, the way this commandment seems to urge, if that leads toward community centered on liberation and life, not oppression.
What could that actually look like in your context, in your community, your church, your life?
The source kind of leaves us with this thought. Maybe God's true blessing isn't found in these massive self-serving projects.
But it comes through that authentic relationship with God, enabling communities that are genuinely about freedom, about justice, about abundant life for everyone.
It's definitely something to think about. How might this deeper understanding of the Second Commandment challenge or maybe enrich your own perspective on faith, power, community, and what it truly means to build something for God, not just for yourself?